This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, good evening everyone. Bruchim Habayim. Tonight's Shiur, for me personally, might be the most fascinating topic I ever spoke about. And I do speak about it with much hesitation. And I will offer you the disclaimer as we get more into the Shiur. Tonight I want to speak about one of the most interesting and colorful personalities in Jewish history, one of the great Gedolei Yisrael, and his name is Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina. Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina. So we begin with a very brief biography from the Sefer Melitzei Eish. The Sefer Melitzei Eish was written by Rabbi Avram Stern. Rabbi Avram Stern was the father of the Debretziner Rav, and he wrote an amazing work, really an amazing work. The name of this work is Melitzei Eish. What it does is it's multi-volume, and he speaks about every day of the Jewish calendar and whose yahrzeit it was on that day, and he gives a brief biography about the personality who passed away on that day. So in his entry, for Chav Zayin Adar, he speaks about Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina, who was born on Chav Ches Nisan in the year Shin Lamed Aleph. Anybody know what the year Shin Lamed Aleph is? 1571, and actually there's a formula how to translate a Hebrew date into an English date. Very easy, you just add the year 1240. So the year Shin Lamed Aleph is 331, you add 1240, that gets you to 1571. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina was born in the city of Venice, and lo and behold, who is his moyel? Somebody who, if you've been listening to the Shiurim, the name will be very familiar to you, the Rama Mipano. Rabbi Menachem Azariah Mipano was his moyel. And Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina came from a very prestigious family, a wealthy family, a family of officers, of officials, of governors, very prestigious family. His grandfather, from his father's side, actually wrote a Shulchan Aruch, similar to the Beis Yosef Shulchan Aruch, and he passed away before it was published. Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina was what Rabbi Avram Stern calls a nar nifla. He was a wonder child. How is that? When he was 10 years old, he already spoke in the shul. He was already giving drashos in the shul from age 10. At age 13, he was already publishing major svarim that were bepela le'enei rayav. At age 19, he's given an invitation from the great Rabbanim of Venice, most notably Shik. And that's not his first name, and that's not his last name. His name is just plain Shik. How is that? Shmuel Yehuda Katzenellenbogen. Have you ever heard the name Katzenellenbogen? You go to Harnof, one of the main thoroughfares, Katzenellenbogen. He was the son of one of the greatest Gedolim ever to live in Italy, the Maram Padua. Maram Padua Meir Katzenellenbogen. By the way, most Jews today, I don't know about most, many Jews today trace back to Rav Meir Katzenellenbogen. In fact, I have a 2-volume work at home, maybe a total of 1,000 pages, of all the people 100 years ago who trace back directly to Rav Meir Katzenellenbogen, including my own family. I didn't even realize it. Not everybody traces back to Rav Meir Katzenellenbogen. So his son, Rav Shmuel Yehuda Katzenellenbogen, was the Rav of Venice. He invites Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina to give a major address. So imagine, in the big shul in Venice, hundreds and hundreds of people, and they gather to hear a 19-year-old kid. He was a pella be'enei kol royav. He was somebody who was a shalem in all chachmos, as we're about to learn. He knew many disciplines, not only Torah, but almost all disciplines, and we're going to get a little picture and a little flavor who he was. However, he lived a very tragic life. His first son, his oldest son, died in his bed. His second son was murdered. His third son went off the derech, went to Brazil, and was never heard of again. So his 3 boys did not have nachas from them. His girls also, a number of them passed away. Nebuch, his wife, lost her mind, and he had a very difficult marriage. And with all of this, says Rabbi Avram Stern, he suffered everything and he tolerated everything, bi'ahava, and he was somebody who fought for the principles of the Torah. He upheld the values of the Torah. He fought for the authority and the great dignity of the Torah Sheba'al Peh. He was a hero of our people. There was an episode where the Talmud was going to be burnt, and he interceded with the government. Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina. This is the biography given by Rav Avram Stern. And so far, this biography really tells you absolutely nothing about the life of Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina. So let's start very slowly. Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina wrote many Sfarim, at least 26 Sfarim. I want to start by telling you something that he writes in a sefer called Lev HaAryeh, the heart of the lion. Many of his Sfarim are either have the word Aryeh in it or Yehuda in it. His name is Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina. And the topics that he writes about are very unusual. So for example, and please think very carefully, think analytically, think honestly. If God would come to you right now and say, Sha'al mimeni ve'etna lach, make one request of me and I'll give you whatever you want. Think what you would ask for. What would you ask for? Right? To win the lottery? To live forever? Think. What would you ask? God would say, I'll grant your heart's request. What would it be? Says Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina in his Sefer Lev HaAryeh, what I would ask for, and he said, this is something I thought about many times, there is nothing more that I want than to have a good memory. He said, think about it. If you're an Av Bezdin, every time someone asks you a Shaila, you don't have to say, let me check it up. He said, you'll remember. He says, even a guy of average intelligence, not too smart, not too dumb, if somebody had a perfect memory, they would reach Kamat, the level of Shlomo HaMelech. Because nowadays, everything is already written. Says Rav Yehuda, if a guy who's a Lamdin, anytime an issue comes up, he'll remember every kash and every teretz of the Gemara. A guy who's into Vertlach, he'll remember every cute little Vart. A guy who's a big Darshan, every time he gets up to speak, how many times does somebody get up to speak and after the joy say, oh, I forgot to say this, or I didn't say it at the right moment, or this concept slipped my mind. A guy who's a big tzaddik and likes to keep every halacha, every time an issue comes up, he'll remember exactly what to do. This bracha, that bracha, do this, do that. Says Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina, there is nothing more in life that I would want than a good memory. Okay, very interesting. He wrote an entire sefer on memory. In Parak Ches, he discusses the Gemara in Hayriyos. The Gemara says in Masech Hayriyos, Daf Yud Gimel Amud Beis, there are 5 things that cause a person's memory to falter and to fail, and one of them is someone who's ragil bezesim, someone who is accustomed to eat olives. I happen to love olives. But it says someone who's ragil bezesim. So Rav Chaim Kanievsky says ragil means more than once every 30 days. Then the Gemara says there are different things that restore your memory, and one of them is olive oil. So it says Rav Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina, I am frequent to say that which the father makes you forget, the kid makes you remember. In other words, that which the olive makes you forget, the oil makes you remember. And therefore, if you have a combination of the two, they sort of neutralize each other. By the way, Rav Chaim Kanievsky in his Sefer on Memory rejects this concept. He doesn't quote Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina, but this is what he writes, and then he says the following amazing thing. He says, and I know about myself that when I was a young kid, until I was 13 years old, you know what I ate for breakfast every day? I didn't have Fruity Pebbles. That's why kids have ADHD, because they have Fruity Pebbles. I didn't have Fruity Pebbles. Every morning for breakfast, I had a slice of bread with olive oil, and I had the best memory in the generation. Okay. Until the times that my mind started to confuse me, and we'll talk about that as well. Well, Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina wrote another very interesting sefer. Look at number 5 on your sheet. Here's the title page. This is Mamish Hafla V'Fela. As far as I know, this is the only sefer of this genre. The name of the sefer is Sur Meira. Turn away from bad. You know what it's about? Gambling. It's about, no, not the cons of gambling. The pros and cons of gambling. And there are 2 characters in the book, Sur Meira. Eldad and Medad. It's a conversation between Eldad and Medad. And Eldad is like a straight guy, you know those kind of guys, you know, the guy who always does the right thing, always knows how to stay away from trouble. And Medad is a young businessman. His father had a business, and he sort of got caught up with bad characters who persuaded him, and all of a sudden one day Eldad sees the guy dropped his job, he doesn't learn anymore, he doesn't talk to his family, and he has this look in his eye, and he says, Medad, what's with you? And Medad said, what do you mean? I have a new job. Yeah, what do? Papers and dice, gambling, poker, blackjack, you name it. He describes the different types of gambling. You should know in Venice, in the 16th, 17th century, gambling was part of life. It was something that people did. Okay. And so Eldad confronts Medad. Don't you know you're going to lose your money? You're going to lose you're going to lose your friends. And Medad says, "How am I different than anybody else? Some people they sell merchandise. Some people are doctors. Some people are lawyers. Some people are professionals. Some people sell used cars. And I spin the dice. It's a noble profession like any other." And the whole sefer, it's an amazing sefer. Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Modina writes an entire work, pages and pages and pages, about the arguments you can make why gambling is therapeutic, and ultimately how it really destroys people. And basically, Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Modina says, don't even try it. Sometimes, and I'm telling you, Eitz Tova, there are people who I know, who they said, I'll just try it, it's fun, I'll go on vacation, I'll just try it once. If a person has an iota of an impulsive behavior, you are jeopardizing your life. It is something which is extremely addictive. It's one of the worst addictions. I know great people who fell into the trap. Oh yeah, I'll just try it one time. Whenever I go to New Jersey, whenever I go to the West Coast, I'll just try it. You should know it's not worth trying. And I'm not saying it because I'm trying to be frum. I'm worried about your life. People who have any, and to persuade someone, you see, people don't realize. I'm a calm guy, so I could hack it, but your friend might be an impulsive guy. Impulsive people really destroy their life. And the greater you are, the more likely you could fall into it. Well, I'm just telling you then, you'll see what I mean. This is his sefer, Sur Meira. Sur Meira. Moira Rabbi said, does anybody know how old Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Modina was when he wrote the sefer Sur Meira? Unbelievable. He was 13 years old when he wrote his first sefer Sur Meira. In fact, and for the rest of the share, I want to give a major disclaimer. And that is, it is not my derech to even intimate any deficiency or any shortcoming, chas v'shalom, in Gedolei Yisrael or Talmidei Chachamim. I am far from a great person, and lev yodea maras nafshi, but one thing I could tell you, I personally love Talmidei Chachamim. And the last thing I would do is try to diminish their prestige in anybody's eyes. So I will give the following disclaimer for the rest of the shir. Why I'm even speaking about this. Number one, the first thing is that Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Modina wrote a brutally honest autobiography. And the name of it is Chaye Yehuda, which is one of the most interesting reads you'll ever come across. Chaye Yehuda. They have a translation in English. I recommend getting it. Chaye Yehuda. But still, you might say, just because he decided to write about it, it's not necessary for public consumption. We'll see the Chida actually quotes from the Sefer, and he, presumably that means he feels that it's something that Jewish people can read. And the third thing, it's something I heard from my Rabbeim. So I hope, Tamachti Seidoisai, I hope I have strong enough justification for speaking about this topic. Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Modina wrote a brutally honest autobiography. And he was a very big list maker. He made lists of everything. He made lists of all the Rabbanim he gave smicha to. And he made a list of all the Sfarim he published. So for example, if you look at number 6, in the Sefer Chaye Yehuda, which is his autobiography, he writes his consolation in this world, he lived a very difficult life, was that he knew if he published a Sfarim, his name would not be erased forever. He knows for all eternity people would remember his name through his Sfarim. Okay, the first Sefer he ever wrote, take a look at number 6 on the 6th line, Sur Meira v'hu dialogu. What's a dialogu? A dialogue. Al Shevach Ugnus Hatzchoik. The pros and cons of gambling. Chiyuv Chibartiv bin Urai. I wrote it when I was a young kid. Ben Yud Gimel Shana. I was 13 years old. I didn't write my name on it. Nobody knew I published it. Why? I didn't want it to get out. People say, who's Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina? Oh, he's the rabbi who writes about gambling. I didn't want to become known by the sefer, so I wrote it anonymously. So I want to draw your attention to a number of the other svarim that he wrote. He wrote Sifrei Shalas Tshuva Ziknei Yehuda. He wrote an expanded version of the Ein Yaakov Beis Lechem Yehuda. He wrote Lev Aryeh about memory, Golos Yehuda, Midbar Yehuda. He wrote a sefer Tzemach Tzaddik. But you know what Tzemach Tzaddik is? A Christian by the name of Fior di Verto wrote a Christian book about Midos Tovos. Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina translated into Hebrew, and every time Fior quotes the New Testament or Christian theologians, Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh takes it out and quotes the Maimer Chazal. So you could see that's a very dangerous sefer. He basically took a Christian manual of ethics, and every time they quote a Christian source, he replaced it with Divrei Chazal. Let me tell you a little bit about his life. Who was his Rebbe? Okay, this is a very Italian name. His name was Samuel Archibaldi. That was his name. Or in Hebrew, Shmuel Arkavalti. Shmuel Arkavalti taught him song and music. And he told him, and by the way, does anybody know, how old was Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina when he sat and learned from his Rebbe? He was 10 years old. So he was ready by the time he was 10 years old. He was already considered a Gadol B'Yisrael. He was already giving drashos. Unbelievable thing. His Rebbe told him that his Rebbe considered him that a Talmud b'demusay u'v'tzalmay, like, a Talmud after his Rebbe's heart. Well, the year was 1589. Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina was born in 1571, and his mother tells him, Yehuda, it's about time. Got to get married. His mother's hacking him. No, get married. I have just the girl for you. Why don't you marry Estherol, my niece? Estherol, my sister's daughter. Now you have to know, Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina was very involved in everything superstitious. And he decided he has to consult with somebody who he should marry. So who is he going to do? He'll ask God. So of course, what did he do? He did a She'elas Chaloim. Obviously without causing any Malach Yashars to swear, because that gets very dangerous, just Eitzah Tova. If you're going to make a She'elas Chaloim, don't make the Malachim swear. And he went to sleep, and in his dream he saw an old man. And an old man led him to an ornate picture, and the picture was covered by a curtain. And the old man pulls away the curtain, and lo and behold, it's Estherol in her wedding gown. And he couldn't believe it. And then he's looking at her face, and all of a sudden the face changes to somebody else. Like those pictures they have today, they have a picture, and all of a sudden they change, or the face morphs into... He wakes up in the morning, he tells his parents, what are you telling? Oh, nonsense. Sure enough, a year later, his mother meets Estherol's mother. They propose the shidduch, and he's headed to Estherol to get married. He comes to Estherol, and Estherol's lying in her bed. She's sick like a dog. And they say, don't worry, it's just a virus, it's a whatever, she'll get better. And the days pass, and she's waning, and she's deteriorating. And they say, don't worry, it's just shilshul. You know what shilshul is? Good. Okay. And Estherol is about to die. And what happens next is not for a general audience. I'll let you read it for yourself. But Estherol dies. And they bury her. And then right after the burial, the whole family turns to Yehuda Aryeh's mother and say, Estherol has a sister just as good as her named Ruchel. Why don't you marry Rachel? And he had no choice. He had to marry Rachel. And then he understood the meaning of his dream. She saw Estherol. By the way, he saw her wedding gown. When he met her for the first time, he told his mother, this is the exact gown that I saw in my dream. Again, some of these details are not things that you would expect from your, regular Gadol B'Yisrael, but this was what he writes in his own words. 1601, he has his third son. And it's Chav Tes Nisan, and he's trying to come up with a name. And now we're going to start to get a little picture of what this man was like. And he thinks to himself, Avraham, such a typical name. Yitzchak, Yaakov, how many Jews are named? Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisach. Zevulun. Why don't Jews name their kids Zevulun? Like, what's wrong with Zevulun? He was one of the kids of Yaakov Avinu. Why have they rejected the name Zevulun? I'm going to name my kid Zevulun to preserve the name. And anyway, Venice, by the way, is on the sea, is on the water. And Zevulun l'chayf yamim yishkain. And he names his kid Zevulun. Okay, so now you're getting a little bit of a flavor for the type of personality. Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina was probably the most talented man who ever lived. He literally was able to jack of all trades. But in Yiddish, there's an expression. He could do everything, and he can't do anything. Well, Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina could do anything. The only problem is he could not make a buck. He lists all the professions that he had, and none of them worked. So first of all, look at number 10. He taught Jews. He taught Goyim. By the way, when he would give a drasha, the Jews would pack the synagogue. The Christians would pack the synagogue. The French would pack the synagogue. Nobody spoke as eloquently as Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina. He taught Goyim. He taught handwriting. He taught drush. You needed a drasha? You're graduating? Your great nephew is having a bas mitzvah? Your dog is being voted the vice president? Anything. You had an occasion, he wrote the speech. He wrote matzevas. He wrote poems. He was a sofer. He was a dayan. He was a rosh yeshiva. He gave smicha. You needed someone to write a letter. He wrote music. He wrote badchanos. He wrote sonnets. He wrote poetry. He was a comedian. He wrote comedy. He was a producer. He was a director. He was a trader. He was an alchemist. He was a diviner. He was a trader, and of course, the most important profession of all, he was a shadchan. The only problem was he could not make a buck. And unfortunately, he had one vice. And that was, he was an addicted gambler. Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina, who wrote the Sefer on gambling, was an addicted gambler. You say, how could we say such a thing? He writes over and over and over again in his autobiography that Nebuch, he couldn't control it. Now, just imagine, obviously times are different. Nowadays, there would be a witch hunt. The local rabbis would remove the person. Back then, he remained the Gadol Hadar, or at least the chief rabbi in Venice throughout his career. Nobody was able to budge him. There was nobody like him. Ein kamoisai. There's no one as talented, no one as brilliant as Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina. And yet he admitted he had this vice. In fact, the way he writes about it, he writes, one Chanukah, S'choik asali hasatan, the Satan mocked me. He damaged me, and it wasn't small. I lost 100 dukes. Now, you could feel for the man, because obviously the reason he was reduced to gambling is he couldn't make money. He couldn't. Now, whose fault is that? One thing is, you got to pay your rabbis. Okay. Apparently, all of his professions and all of his side jobs and all of his, talents didn't do him any good. The year was 1630. Gambling became rampant in Venice to the point where the presidents of the shuls got together and they made a cherem that anyone who gambles, poker, blackjack, whatever their lucky sevens, I don't know, what is that? It's like whatever it is, the slot machines, you're in cherem. They put a cherem. Says Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh to the presidents of the shul, since when do you have authority to put people in cherem? You don't have authority to do that. Where does it say in the Torah you can't gamble, he says. Show me. And he had them rescind the cherem. Said Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh, I'm against gambling, but people are going to ask for something. It's davar sheyef shalamay boy. Most people can't help themselves, he says. Or at least, it's something that they should not end, by the way, in deference to Rabbi Yehuda Medina. The Gedolim of the time agreed with him. So, for example, we have the Sefer Pachad Yitzchak. Pachad Yitzchak was written by Rabbi Yitzchak Lamprunti. Yitzchak Lamprunti wrote one of the greatest works. It's called Pachad Yitzchak, not to be confused with Rav Hutner. He wrote multi-volumes, the first Jewish encyclopedia, where every concept that begins with Aleph is volume 1, and then Beis and Gimel, volume 2. And he did this without computers. You ever see Encyclopedia Talmudis? 25 volumes up to the letter Zayin or something like that, or Chaf. And how many Chachamim over the years worked on it? Dozens and dozens. Rabbi Yitzchak Lamprunti himself wrote an entire encyclopedia without a computer. Rabbi Yitzchak Lamprunti records this whole episode of Rabbi Yehuda Medina destroying the Cherem, and he concurs with it. Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh, unfortunately, had a difficult marriage. His wife was Yatsa Midaita. His wife lost some of her sanity, and he writes about the difficulty he had controlling himself, about the deterioration that she brought upon him, how if he would live another 1,000 years, he could never recover from the pain that she caused him. His body would never recover from the destruction she brought upon him. How she would scream at him for no reason, and he would lose his cool, and his blood would boil. A very brutally honest autobiography, to the point where he writes he developed an abscess and pus in his lungs, and he was lying in his deathbed, and he had said vidoy already. And he's sitting there looking at the ceiling, and the days are passing, and he's dying, and after weeks and months, he's saying to himself, you can't die forever. How long could you die for? He said he got sick and tired of dying, so he decided to live. He says he got bored of dying, so he got out of bed, and he said, look, I'll never be able to darshan the way I once was, but better to live instead of, he just got bored of dying, and that's what he writes, he got out of bed. Okay. Unbelievable stuff. The last place that I would have expected to find any information about Rabbi Yehuda Medina is the Shalos Teshuvos Tzitz Eliezer. Tzitz Eliezer, the contemporary posek, he's the posek of Shari Tzedek Hospital. And somebody asked the Tzitz Eliezer the following question. In a shul you have two areas. You have the bima and you have the amud. The bima, you learn from the Torah. At the amud, you daven for the amud. And in certain shuls, the shul is very cavernous, it's a very large shul. If you're going to daven from the amud, people are not going to hear you so well. So in some shuls, they wanted to know, could you daven from the bima? And the Tzitz Eliezer was once posed with that question. He said, no, the bima is a completely different place on the amud, the bima is very high up. And they sent the question back to him, what about like a Hasidic shtibel, where the bima is on the floor, just like the amud, and they're basically right next to each other, does it really matter? And he said the following, I warned, Hizaharu ad ma'oid shaloi l'shanois davar mehanog ve'hamakubel b'sidrei beis hakneses. This is Shalos Teshuvos Tzitz Eliezer, Chelik Yud Zayin, Siman Chav Tes, number 16. You got to be careful, do not change an iota from the seder of the way davening was for the last few hundred years. What's wrong? We'll just get together and go around and dance a little bit. New things. So it says that you cannot tamper a hair's breadth, a dust particle, with the way davening goes. The way our fathers and our grandfathers davened, we cannot budge from that. And therefore, I am very circumspect of anybody who wants to move any part of the tefillah from the amud to the bima. But it says in Shalos Teshuvos, Ziknei Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Medina, that you're allowed to. Listen to these words. Eineni chafetz lakachas klal b'cheshboin l'mashara'isi b'sefer Shalos Teshuvos Ziknei Yehuda. I do not entertain what he says. What he says does not go into the mix. Number one, he's a Sephardi. What does he know about Minhagei Ashkenaz? Sfardim don't have an Omer and a Bima, they just have a Bima. He doesn't know about Ashkenazic custom. And number two, Kiyadu, it's well known that Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina was very quick to violate Minhagim. And our Minhagim of Ashkenaz are a very severe thing we don't tamper with. Okay, so now you see the Tzitz Eliezer was not so happy with Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina. He's not giving him a ringing endorsement. But that's nothing. Because then the following Shaila came to the Tzitz Eliezer. This is Tzitz Eliezer, Chilek Yud Gimel, Siman Yud Beis. This is one of the most startling tshuvas I ever read. They asked the Tzitz Eliezer, could you sing, basically rock and roll, to davening? You know, take one of the golden oldies, music that people put to Divrei Agavim, to maybe inappropriate lyrics, and use it for Kaddish, for Kedusha. And the question was based on the fact that Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina was very into music. Now you should know, if you think singing by davening is a Jewish thing, it's not. It was not originally a Jewish thing. In fact, Slabodka Yeshiva, let me tell you the nusach that they davened Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Our nusach is Ma'avir Yaim U'Mevi Loila U'Mavdi. Their nusach was U'Ma'avir Yoim U'Mevi Loila U'Mavdil Bein Yoim. That was their tune. They held tunes take away kavana. So he said, "No, come on. I'll give you an example. When somebody sings, let's say, so what are you thinking at that time? Usually I'm thinking about the composer. I'm thinking about Shlomo Carlebach. Are you thinking about the words, or are you thinking about the composer? Or somebody sings, a tune. You're thinking about the original words to that tune. Okay, that's a debate. Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina was one of the first people who very much wanted to introduce music to davening. After all, he was a great musician. Almost all the Gedolim were against him. And he admits the people who were against him were the Toifsei HaTorah, were the Gedolei Yisrael. Says Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina, so therefore says the Tzitz Eliezer, even Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina, he never said you could put rock and roll to davening. He just said regular music to davening. But says the Tzitz Eliezer, do you see the language he uses when he talks about those who oppose him? He says that when people daven without music, they sound like dogs and ravens. They're koirei el Hashem kekelev v'cha'orei. That's what you say about Gedolei Yisrael, who said not to introduce music to davening. Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina said they sound like a bunch of noyarim. They sound like donkeys when they daven. Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina allowed chazanim, some chazanim, yismechu, yismechu, right? They repeat words. Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina said you could do that. So it says you're not to do that. So you see that he's not somebody who really we should follow. And therefore listen to these words. Ein lehispal mi divrei hachacham ho'italki hazeh. Do not be moved by this Italian rabbi. Don't even be surprised about the things he wrote. Ki hayu ish adam hafachpach. He was a guy who couldn't make up his mind. He would just change his mind all the times. He waged war, says the Tzitz Eliezer, against the Gedolei Yisrael, no less than reform. Says the Tzitz Eliezer, I just quote to you his words. It's not only one person who considered him a kaifer. He himself writes, he didn't wear a black hat, can you imagine? No, but I think what he means is he didn't wear a yarmulke. He writes about himself that he did not wear a yarmulke on the street. He paskin, you don't have to. Many Sfardim don't, till today. He paskin, you don't have to. He also wrote the following thing, which no Gadol will ever swallow standing. That the words of Chazal, it depends on the generation. In some generations, they're serious. Other generations, you don't have to take it so seriously. Says it Tzitz Eliezer, Yoimar no Yisrael, Hasher Kalazer, Rav Poisek Yikare. You call this guy a rabbi? People wanted to say you can't play soccer on Shabbos. He laughed at them. What's wrong with playing soccer on Shabbos? Says it Tzitz Eliezer, he gambled his whole life, and he couldn't shake it. He couldn't kick it. This is a rabbi? He himself writes, one time on Shavasa B'Tammuz, he couldn't help himself and he gambled. Says Tzitz Eliezer, his Torah is like the Torah of Doeg HaAdoimi. And therefore, Loi Mala V'loi Moirid Mimashikasav B'Ziknei Yehuda. What he says is irrelevant. Mamish Dvarim Ayumim. This is someone, Rabbi Avram Stern, he calls, one of the great defenders of the Jewish people. Rabbi Avram Stern was not a middle of the road. He's the father of Debretzina Rav. Tzitz Eliezer says, it's irrelevant what the man says. I want to tell you one more controversy, two more controversies. One of the things that he said, Rabbi Yehuda, he says, let me ask you a question. You ever go to a baseball game? So, you did? This one. So when they sing the national anthem, what do people do? Right? They take off their hat. It's a sign of respect to take off your hat. In Italy, it was a sign of respect to uncover your head in front of great people. Says Rabbi Yehuda, imagine two people go in front of a prince. One of them is wearing a yarmulke, and one of them has a yarmulke off. Which guy is better? The guy who's showing courtesy and etiquette, or the guy who's standing on his age-old principles? Different times call for changes. Says Tzitz Eliezer, this is a rabbi. He wrote a sefer called Shagas Aryeh. In Shagas Aryeh, he valiantly defends Torah Sheba'al Peh. The only problem is, who does he defend it from? There was another heretical work called Kol Sakal. And Rabbi Yehuda defends the Torah Sheba'al Peh from the Kol Sakal. The only thing is, many have accused him of writing the Kol Sakal as well. And he sort of had regret, and he had a change of heart. I heard from very great people that since he denied writing the Kol Sakal, we take him at face value, and he just wrote the Shagas Aryeh, and he maintains his Cheskes Kashrus. He wrote another work, and this we know he wrote. He wrote a sefer Ari Noyim, the lion that roars, which is against Kabbalah. He did not believe that the Zohar HaKadosh was written by Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. Amazingly, he didn't publish it, but word got out that he published it, and 100 years later, a young man by the name of Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who was embroiled in great turmoil because he was claiming that Malachim appeared to him, and Eliyahu Hanavi appeared to him, and the Malach Matad appeared to him, and that he was busy being Masaki in the Cheder Mechiras Yosef, and the Gedolim of Venice put him in Cherem. And they made him take a shvuah that he would not teach Kabbalah again. And here this young, brilliant man, who's the greatest master of Kabbalah possibly ever, is chained, and he just has to write. And he tells his Rabbi Shaya Bason, that I need to defend Kabbalah. And I have over here on number 21, a letter from his Rabbi Shaya Bason, giving a haskama. The Ramchal wrote a sefer called Choiker Umekubal, or Maimer Havikuach, defending Kabbalah from who? Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina. Now his sefer was not published yet even, but the Ramchal heard that he wrote it, that he published it, that he wrote it, and the Ramchal could not contend. Now it says Rabbi Shai Bason, when my students sent me the manuscript of Maimer Havikuach, I didn't want to let him publish it. Not because, listen carefully, I didn't think he was right. Because Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina commanded such respect from the Jewish community, I felt that Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto would just dig himself deeper into his controversy. Can you imagine? Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina actually garnered more respect challenging the Kabbalah than the Ramchal did defending it. But ultimately, Rabbi Shai Basson let him publish it. Others endorsed it. I want to tell you a name. By the way, sometimes you say this name, that name. Sam Sofer says a klal on the pasuk. Vishamata Yisrael Vishamarta Lasais. That when you say the names of Gedolim, it's mashpia kedusha on you to be mekayim the mitzvahs. So just to hear the names is worthwhile. There was a great Goin and Tzaddik in the times of Ramchal named Reb Aviad Sar Shalom Bazila, who actually was the one who gave a haskama to the Archaim HaKadosh. Anyway, he also endorsed the sefer of Rabbi Yehuda, of the Ramchal. But what's amazing is, if you look in Rabbi Yehuda Armi Modina's biography, he says, what motivated me to write against the Zohar, he writes very nobly, I was so angry at all the Gedolim who challenged the Rambam. The Rambam, of course, was a great rationalist. The Rambam didn't have a Zohar. And many challenged the Rambam. The Rambam's against the Kabbalah. And I was so upset of the people who challenged the Rambam. To defend the Rambam, I sort of... So that maybe what... So, if we had to make an assessment of Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina, what would we say? I mean, Tzitz Eliezer basically says we don't pay any attention to him. We don't entertain his ideas. They're foreign, they're alien, they're dangerous, they're beyond the pale. And what's very confusing is, one of the greatest books ever written was the Chidah Sefer Shem HaGedolim, where he lists the names of all the Gedolei Yisrael who lived before him. And you would think if the Chidah shared the same opinion as the Tzitz Eliezer, he would not include Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina on the who's who list of Gedolei Yisrael. And he made it. He's on the list. Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina is on the great list of the Chidah of Gedolei Yisrael. Look at number 23. Says Rabbi Yehuda says the Chidah, Mareinu Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina, Echad Mirabane Venezia, one of the rabbis in Venice. Medaktek, a great Medaktek. By the way, if you want to know who this is on the back page, that's him. LM, what's LM? Leon Modina. Leon in English is Yehuda Aryeh. Leon Modina. He was a Medaktek, he was a singer, he was a darshan, he wrote Svarim. Now, if this man is beyond the pale, how could the Chidah even bring him down as somebody who's being endorsed as one of the Gedolei Yisrael? Says the Chidah, I want to tell you some of his Divrei Torah. I'll tell you very, very quickly. He says on the pasuk, this is a chidush from Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina, "Tifra'u kol atzasi v'teichachti lo yavisem." You rejected my counsel, you did not want my musar, and another pasuk says, listen to musar, shimu musar, v'al tifra'u. So Yehuda Aryeh says like this. You know, if you buy something in the store, you could shame it, you could embarrass it. Let's say you buy a Lexus. So you buy the Lexus, and then you could say whatever you want about it. Oh, it's a bad car, it's a slow car, it's an ineffective car. You bought it, you paid for it, you own it, you could say whatever you want. But if someone gives it to you as a gift, you can't talk about it. It's not nice to the giver. Same thing with people who give drashas. If you pay for the drasha, you think you own it. Ha! That drasha. He only said it because this. He only said because of that. He was trying to say this. He doesn't really mean it. He doesn't keep it himself. But if you don't pay for the drasha, then it's the Baal Darshan's drasha. You can't say anything about it. So Yehuda Aryeh Mimodina would say like this: "V'atifra'u kol atzasi." You used to pay me for my drashos. V'soichachti lo yavisem. That's why you don't listen to my musar. And therefore, my advice is shimu musar v'chachmu al tifro. I don't want your money. Maybe that's why he couldn't make money. Okay. Now, but maybe you'll say, okay, the Chidah is only quoting from his Svarim, but maybe he would never quote his autobiography. The Chidah would never want a Jew to read Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Modina's autobiography. No, he quotes the autobiography. And he says, look over there. Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh writes about his life, all the good things and the bad things. And says the Chida, let me tell you one thing that he says about himself. Rabbi Aryeh Modina, who did not accept Kabbalah, did not believe in Gilgulim. He didn't believe in it. By the way, it's an amazing thing. He believed in every superstition in the world. Divination and amulets. Not Kabbalah, not Gilgulim. Until one day, a family had a child, and the child was very sick, and basically the child was near death for its whole life. Until 6 months old, he's called in, the child's about to die. The child couldn't talk, the child couldn't do anything. And they asked Rabbi Aryeh to say, the last rites with the child, and as the child is about to die, all of a sudden the child opens up its mouth, cries out, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, like a zaken v'ragel. Says Rabbi Aryeh, that's it. Seeing is believing. He accepted upon himself the concept of Gilgulim. So, if you had to make an assessment of Yehuda Aryeh Medina, what was he? Who is he? Do we accept him? Do we not accept him? Tzitz Eliezer has very harsh things to say. Chida, listen. What in the final analysis, what does Klal Yisrael have to say about Yehuda Aryeh Medina? He said, I don't know, I never heard of him. Mamish is Maval al Arayan. There's a tefillah we say, Erev Rosh Chodesh. Some people only say it Erev Rosh Chodesh Elul, Yom Kippur Katan. If people go to Reb Chaim Kanievsky, they need a Yeshua. Reb Chaim Kanievsky says, say Yom Kippur Katan. One of the main piyutim in Yom Kippur Katan, Erev Rosh Chodesh, take a look at number 24. Yom Zeh, on this day, Yehi Mishkal Kol Chatoisai, my sins should be weighed. Batel b'miyutai kidmus yareach, my sins should be abolished. B'miyut, like the moon. Hayoim levad, misvar zechuyos hayirbe, today alone, my mitzvahs should be counted. And you look at the first letter of each stanza. Yehuda Aryeh Medina. One of the traditional tefillos of Klal Yisrael. There's another one, by the way. It was written by none other than Rabbi Aryeh. The same person, Tzitz Eliezer, says, don't pay any attention to him. Some people said he was Ka'in, a heretic. Tzitz Eliezer said, this is a rabbi. He's like, Doyik ha'adoimi. We still say his tefillos. So you might say this is very confusing. Tzitz Eliezer says we don't pay attention to his halachos. The Chida obviously held he was a gadol, and he's in the Siddur. So what was he? Who's right? Was it Tzitz Eliezer right? Was the Chida right? Is the Siddur right? And the answer is yes. That's the answer. Tzitz Eliezer is right, and the Chida is right, and the Siddur is right. They're all right. We don't follow his halachos. The poskim consider his halachos maybe a little off the beaten track. Achrei Rabim Lahatos. Something you have to realize is, this is something Rameir Shapiro writes about. There are legitimate strands in Judaism, but as time passes, the Gedolei Yisrael are always very careful and very on guard to weed out any vestige of something that could remotely be challenging. You say that's so narrow-minded. We don't have a choice. We don't have a choice. We're not great enough to open up. We're not great enough. We're not great enough to start deciphering these types of ideas. Rabbi Yehuda Medina mingled with Christians. Does that mean he wasn't a gadol b'Yisrael? He was a great gadol. He was a great person. We could say his tefillos. But we don't follow his halachos. We don't follow his halachos. The Rameir Shapiro writes, throughout history there have been two kinds of communities. The German communities and the Hungarian communities. Pressburg and Frankfurt and Berlin. And they're both legitimate. But one of them works better than the other. Historically, doesn't mean one is more right. It doesn't mean it's more right to be more sort of closeted in. Doesn't mean that's more of a correct approach. So it just means it just happens to work better. It just happens to be that Klal Yisrael is safer that way. And the Gedolei Yisrael are the Einei Ha'eda, they're the eyes of the congregation. They're able to see repercussions of when an idea, maybe it's a right idea, maybe it's a correct idea, maybe it's even an idea of a Gadol B'Yisrael. But where is it going to lead? So Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Modina was a great Paitan, and we use his tefillos. He was a great Gadol. And he's also somebody that we don't follow halachically. But his legacy does live on. And there's a lot that we did learn from him and about him tonight. And I do want to focus on one of his qualities that's something we should take with us. And he wrote a tzava. He wrote an ethical will. And in his ethical will, he basically says he doesn't trust anybody if to say a hesped about him. So therefore he's going to write his own hesped. And he doesn't trust anybody to say it except for his son-in-law. The only problem is his son-in-law died before he was able to deliver the hesped to anybody. And therefore basically he said, I don't want anyone to be masped me. All they could say is the following. La Ya'arichu, this is page 6, number 25, the paragraph that begins Al Derech. Ayin Daled. La Yarbu v'la Ya'arichu b'shum shvach. They should not go out and speak about me greatly. Rak loymar, just say the following. Loy hayisi min hatzivuem. I wasn't a hypocrite. That's what I want them to say about me. I wasn't a hypocrite. I didn't think one thing and say something else. It was toichi kabari. I was pure. Whatever I was on the inside, that's the way I was on the outside. But he says more than that. V'yarei Elokim v'sar meira yoyser b'seiser mi'begalai. I feared God more on my inside even than my outside. People on the outside, they say maybe I was liberal. Okay, people like to call him the first Renaissance rabbi. That's people who don't understand who he was. He says, people, I am much greater on my inside than I am on my outside. I didn't show favoritism to anyone or to any idea. I did not tolerate anything which I did not believe was true, not in others and not in me. I was brutally honest with the world, and I was brutally honest with myself. And that's a certain transparency and a certain straightforwardness. That's something that everybody could learn from. Basically, he felt his most admirable quality was he wasn't a hypocrite. And that's not something that many of us could say confidently and honestly. So, Rabbi Sai is a Shabbat Shav and Aliyah, and hopefully something that we could learn from. Abi Asgal Tzadim here for you.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.